This is the Cambridge Creative Writing Centre series of conversations with writers. We're excited to have you here. For anyone who doesn't know him already, today I'm in conversation with Fraser Grace, the playwright and poet and a tutor at ICE. Hi, Fraser.
Hello.
So one of the things I was really interested in that I wanted to talk to you about today was the poetry website that you've just launched, and I wondered if you can tell me a bit more about it.
Yeah, I suppose in a way it's a bit of a response to lockdown and feeling that it's very odd for a playwright not to have work being seen and connecting with an audience. It's just really odd, and I had quite a big theatre project lined up, which has, like many theatre projects, had to be sort of shelved for the time being. And poetry is something I've kind of come back to. I used to tour a bit as a performance poet, so it's always been part of my sort of thinking and reading, but I've come back to it more in the last couple of years, and so I thought, right, okay, now's the time. I'm going to set up a website. So the website is called The Word Cage, and the idea is that we use it to release words into the wild. And at the moment, we're going through a sort of rolling program of stocking the site with poetry. We also have a guest poet who our inaugural guest is Andrea Porter, who's a poet I worked with years ago. I adapted a suite of her poems for the radio, for Radio 4. So it's great to have that opportunity as well. Now we've got a kind of vehicle to release other people's work into the world a little bit. We can't accept submissions, but we load up my poetry, and as I say, we also have this guest writer, and that will change over time. But Andrea's our guest writer for the inaugural phase.
So do you think, I mean, I was thinking about the links between the two kinds of writing that you do, and do you ever have that experience that something starts to kind of go round and round in your head, and you want to do something with it, but you realise that perhaps it's going to be a poem, or the scope of it is something to explore in a poem, or would that ever lead on to writing something longer?
Yeah, I'm always struck by a quotation. I think it's from Paul Klee, the artist. He talked about drawing as taking a line for a walk, and poetry, because it is generally, anyway, a short form, is often like that, and plays can begin like that too. Although I think there is something about the necessity of plays to sort of structure an experience through time that means that you can only get so far with that, taking words for a walk and seeing where they lead. The need for structure is probably very vital with plays anyway, just because it's got to get a whole audience through whatever it is, 2 hours with a gin break. So you've got to, at some point, you've got to kind of make structural decisions and build the play. Poetry is a little bit like that, though I think for a lot of people who write poetry in a very sort of personal way, it is very much taking a line for a walk. You have a feeling, or you see something, or you're thinking about something, and you start to write, and the poem's meaning kind of reveals itself as you write. Then there might also be this other phase, which is very like playwright writing, where you go and consider it from a more structural view. So there are similarities, but and certainly my plays they've often contained I love a long speech. Um, as well as, you know, there has been a sort of fashion for you know, pure snappy short lines of dialogue. I like a bit of that because it gets energy into the thing, but I've always loved long speeches as well, and sometimes they have effectively been verse of one sort or another. And the moment, actually, I have a project which sort of consciously, again, arising out of the lockdown situation, really, of writing a sort of epic poem, which is dramatic. There are 4 voices, but they are essentially monologues, I suppose, which is based on just something that happened to. I'm one of 4 siblings. I know you've got 4 children, Lucy. I was there. I've been there. I was one of 4. And when the whole coronavirus pandemic thing kicked off, a weird thing befell us, really. I was in China visiting my son. So we had a bit of a scramble to get home and get him home. My brother went to Italy for work and found himself in a country suddenly very rapidly closing down, and had to escape, and went into self-isolation in a cottage in Derbyshire because he's shielding his daughter. My eldest sister, who had just retired and was on a trip of a lifetime to India, suddenly found she had to cut her trip short. She was there with her son, and so they had to make a run for it. And he'd come over. He's been living in New Zealand, so he suddenly found he couldn't go back there, so he had to come back to Britain with her. So they were scrabbling for flights from there. And my sister, who was at home in Derbyshire, but is the kind of carer in chief for my mum, who has dementia, and she's in her late 80s, and she had to go into isolation to shield her. So suddenly all 4 of us in very different ways were trying to cope with not so much the virus itself, but the lockdown.
And journeys.
And journeys, yeah, and flight. Flight is a key word, and that might end up being the title, actually. But it's those sort of 4 different experiences interwoven, and I've been writing it in verse because an actor friend had said to me that she was, you know, just desperate to do some work, and I'd thought of her in this voice of my sister looking after my mum. So that's where I started, and then I've written my section of our experience of getting out of China, and I'm starting work on my brother's section of being in Italy. He's a Formula One nut, so the chance to go to Italy and have a meeting with Ferrari was all he was thinking about until he arrived there and got a text saying, "Oh, it's off." And then he had to scramble to get out. So you know, there is a huge overlap between the 2, sort of structurally, but also in process, I think. But I think in both cases, you can go so far on the taking a line for a walk route, and then there's a sort of structural approach that you often have to engage with as well. Sometimes that solves itself, but very often that's a sort of different kind of process.
Yeah, I think there's a really, it sounds like what you're describing is the sort of the difference between that first draft, that just kind of seeing what happens and then making it into something that you can share and that other people would want to experience, whether that's a poem being read to you, or reading it yourself, or seeing it, seeing a play.
Yeah, because it has to carry an audience or a reader through time, once it gets beyond a certain point. I mean, with poetry, I guess, I mean, and this is something I've discovered very recently, because I've always been rather terrified by the technicalities of poetry. So if someone says sonnet to me, I'm likely to quiver, you know. But I've been engaging with that and finding, actually, when you take one of those sort of structures off the peg, it's quite hard to reveal your voice whilst observing those structures. But what I found was, the more you concentrate on the technicalities, actually a different part of you can kick in, and you don't think that you're kind of revealing much about yourself or any deep thought, but actually, because your attention is on the technicalities, then some other part of you finds voice. That's what I've found anyway. So I've really enjoyed finally having a go at writing a couple of sonnets, and that's been really interesting.
I think it sounds similar to the process of writing a play, that I think the structure of writing particular forms in poetry means that you have to make those really difficult decisions about what you keep, and I think that can be that's just as important in the process of writing as what initially happens when you take that line for a walk.
Yes.
Not all of it matters, but it's quite hard working out what doesn't matter.
Yeah, that is true. That is true, and overall, you know, that thing that I just mentioned, this I think a good sonnet or a good play, however structured it is, there is a voice. There is a voice that carries through and isn't lost in all that, but remains clear and in some ways becomes distilled by the structure.
I think you've definitely got a voice, a clear voice in your poems, and I think the ones on the website that I've been looking at, there's that sense of an individual narrator for each one, and so it feels to me like that is really important in your writing. I wanted to ask you a bit more about this project that you're working on, which sounds quite personal, and I wondered, are you distancing yourself in any way from the fact that these are family members by kind of giving them different names, or you know, how strongly do you feel you have to be true to the experiences, or are you feeling you've got some freedom to take different directions in their stories?
Well, there's definitely something in the setup of that, in the shtick of it, you know, just as I describe it, you know, 4 members of a family, 4 siblings or whatever, and their different experiences. That is worth hanging on to. Actually, and obviously my own experience is fairly, you know, close. I've stuck fairly close to that, and my brother's voice comes through quite clearly. I think it sounds like him. The part that I've written for my sister, who's the carer of my mum, has changed somewhat, mainly because I was thinking of this actor, and I was thinking I want to write her a part. So I'm very much thinking of her in that case, and how she would naturally express things, and so it varies a little bit. I mean, but I think that. And also I've kind of extrapolated from an experience I had with my mum, because I'm a little bit distant from her, but I still, you know, I talk to her most days, and she tells me things, and you know, I've used an incident from that. She told me she was doing something, and I was having, you know, the sort of things that parents say, oh yes, I'm just up a ladder, you know, that sort of thing. You know, and you think, what? And you're miles and miles away, and you can't do anything about it. You're thinking, oh my goodness. So I've been free in that sense, that I've used experiences that are close to me, and I've imported that into this character who supposedly is the sibling that's closest and is the sort of chief carer.
So you're weaving the voice of your mother or the dementia sufferer into the narrative of the person who's the carer. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So it sets up at the moment anyway. I mean, this is the sort of prototype, and perhaps I need to be more adventurous in what can be done. But my idea was that perhaps we, record this using a similar app to the one we're using, and the actors, who may be in isolation themselves or in lockdown, it's quite difficult to pull a rehearsal room together at the moment. That we might be able to record it on such thing as this, or individually record it and then edit it together. So I've kept it. So essentially, there are 4 voices. And I think whenever we get something like that, there's something in us that wants them to come together a little bit, if only technically. So I'm sort of experimenting in how they might sort of weave together in an introduction, and then maybe at the end as well. But I've deliberately tried to keep it so that it could be recorded very, very simply, and in the current circumstance. That's the cunning plan.
So somehow you would get that sense of a live performance. So would it be something that would happen, at a particular time, and that people would need to join your meeting, or that you'd?
Yes, I mean, I'd love that to be the case, and then there might, be a recorded version that we can distribute, and also. I suppose, and this probably is the playwright in me, but the reason why I first really wrote poetry, and as I say, I did work as a performance poet, was really because I'd sort of decided that acting needed to give way to writing, so I'd come out of a theatre company and decided I was going to write, but then then I really missed performing. So then I began to write a show that I could do myself, because that connection with an audience is really important to me. I really I love the whole catharsis of it, that you gear up for a performance and then you have this interaction and then it's done, which you never get that, in my experience anyway, as a writer, pure and simple. I don't think you ever get quite that kind of catharsis, even when a play is performed, because you immediately start thinking about, okay, how's this going to be reviewed, and is it going to transfer, and will there be another production, and so on and so on. So you never really get that sense of catharsis, and I kind of miss that. So yeah, I kind of thought with this, we could record it now, create it now, hopefully, perhaps as a live event, as you say, as a recorded thing. And then when we get our theatre back, please God, that it could be some kind of live performance then.
So it sounds a bit like you're kind of going back to your roots as a writer, that you're thinking. I mean, when you first were writing, was it quite personal what you were writing, or was it more imaginative?
Quite personal. I was writing a thing the other day describing it, and I came up with the word gladiatorial, which I've claimed as a new noun. It's a gladiatorial. It's an editorial on life and various things that you look at, but it's quite kind of, combative with and especially most of the most of the performances I did then were in sort of university bars and things. So it was the sort of setup where you'd got to kind of wrestle an audience. So gladiatorial seemed a very good word for that. That was then, yeah. I think this poetry this time around is rather different. It's more kind of reflective, I think, and very. A lot of it is engaging with a sort of natural world. That's often a sort of starting point. So it is a different thing this time. It's much less like stand-up and more like a crafted. Not that wasn't crafted, but it's a different kind of craft, I think. I suppose my ambition for poetry now is that it can be appreciated on the page or by audio recordings, which is what the Word Cage, the website, does. It gives you the text, but also we've recorded the poet reading, whether that's me or Andrea Porter at the moment. So there are audio recordings, and people have responded to that incredibly well. You know, that where perhaps people who wouldn't necessarily sit and read poetry, but like to hear something read to them.
I was interested in the tag, you know, releasing words into the wild.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
For you, that is about giving them a voice. So, you know, it's a way of the way for you for publishing the poems is to actually articulate them, to kind of actually read them out, and then suddenly they get wings and they're able to fly off. And is that how you imagine it, or is it a bit different?
Yeah, that is it really. And it would appear that really works for people, you know, judging by the number of downloads and things of various poems. Clearly they are going out there, you know. So that's quite pleasing really, because I kind of hope that would be the case, and obviously from the title of the website, the Word Cage, you know, it has within that the idea of these are words sort of brought together but then released into the wild, as we say, and rewording the world. But you know, that idea of, I mean, hopefully, you know, they look great on the page as well, in print, but I like that idea that you know, people can send an audio clip to a friend or send them the link to the site, and they can come and it goes out.
Yeah, I'm often disappointed that I can't put recordings on Twitter. You can't actually just use voice recordings on Twitter, which you can put like GIFs on and things, but
Oh right,
you're out in the natural world and you think, oh wow, I have no idea what that bird is. Obviously I'm listening to nature a lot more than I ever used to because I'm going for a daily walk, and you just want to capture it and you want to be able to share that with somebody, and you know, even as a writer you can't actually describe it well enough to be able to share that moment. That's something really amazing that everybody has that capacity now to just have it in their pocket, a phone that you can just kind of take that snapshot of where you were, a herd snapshot rather than just a photograph.
Yes.
And it's something that I do a lot more than I used to. I really did want to talk to you about Bliss as well, because it feels like this,
thank you.
like grieving process maybe that you might be going through, because you were just, did you say to me that it'd been a project that had been 10 years in the making, is that right?
Yeah, a long time. I wrote so I mean, I'm very the play Bliss is based on a Russian short story by a writer called Andrei Platonov, who I discovered quite by chance. I was researching another Russian play, and came across a short story of his, and immediately began to think about its potential as a play. But actually, when I started off, as has frequently been the case in my career, I start off with an idea and no one else, I run it up the flagpole and no one salutes. So in the end, you then, as a writer, you have that sort of decision. Ideally, the way the commission process works is you talk to somebody about an idea, they get excited, they commission you, and then you write for money, which is always good. But frequently, as I say, in my career, it's not quite happened like that. So I got very excited about this, and I couldn't really get anyone else very excited about it. So in the end, I thought, well, I'll just start working on this, and maybe that in the end the play will convince people. So it's been a long old process, really, of developing it, and then it took my friends at Menagerie Theatre in Cambridge, who run the Hotbed New Writing Festival every year. They said, "Oh, Fraser, have you got anything?" And I said, "This is 2 or 3 years ago." And I said, "Well, I've got this labour of love. I like it, and we did a workshop, a sort of open workshop. We rehearsed a couple of scenes, brought some actors in, and people responded to that well, and Menagerie liked it too, and so we decided to try and build a production, and we ended up giving it its premiere in Russia, in Platonov's hometown, last year. Is it last year? Yeah. And we did a performance in Cambridge as well. I mean, that was all still within the sort of R&D development process. It was very much a shoestring production. And we felt duly enthused and encouraged to launch a full production. So that was all lined up for now, May and June. It was due to open with some performances in St. Petersburg, and then come for a run at the Finborough Theatre in London. And obviously, that's not happened. So it's all in abeyance, really. And the company are all still committed to it, and we're committed to try and give the production its run. We were due to start rehearsals in Bury St Edmunds, and then move them to Peterborough, and then go to St Petersburg. So that's it's and he's in a way it's much. I don't know if you find this, but in some ways it's a lot easier to champion another writer's work sometimes than your own. And for me, he is a remarkable writer, Platonov. He had very little work produced in his lifetime because he made the cardinal error of blossoming at the same time as Stalin. And Stalin is said to have written scum in the corner of one of his stories. And
quite an honour.
Well, what an honour. But he consequently had a rather short and very miserable life. But he's a remarkable writer because he was actually a sort of believer in a way. He felt that there had to be massive social change in Russia, but he was just too clear-sighted. He saw that there were lots of little political battles going on, but actually people were suffering, and at a time when Soviet writers were meant to write about the glorious society to come that was just around the corner, his attention kept drifting back to the way it really was for people now. He couldn't let that go. So as I say, he didn't prosper in his own time, and really his work has only become more widely known since the Berlin Wall came down in the late 80s. But he's a tremendous writer, and this story about two young people trying to pick up the pieces and build a life together after war is very resonant, I think, and is ultimately sort of, I maintain, it is ultimately optimistic because they do. I mean, the play, in a way, it starts with them. They think they've survived, and actually there are a lot of hardships to go through. They're both in different ways rather shattered people, and it takes them a long time to sort of actually arrive at a place where they can begin. But they do arrive at that place, I think, at the end of the play, and that's, so ultimately it is optimistic, but it's certainly not a dewy-eyed view of what it means to live in a committed way together.
Yeah, well, it sounds very realistic. I wanted to ask you about how it feels to work. So were you working, you obviously, I mean, I don't know, do you speak Russian, or were you working with the translation?
No,
And
I don't speak Russian at all. So I was working from, a lot of Platonov's work has been translated by Robert Chandler and his wife Elizabeth, who Robert Chandler's just had a great success with the Grossman books. So he's done a lot in terms of making Platonov's work available to non-Russian speaking people. So I read the short story in that version, and then it is a process of adapting from that short story. So I suppose in a way you're sort of translating and adapting.
yeah,
You're translating into a different idiom, language, but also into a different medium, which has been really good, and it's quite a tricky job actually, because it's very as a lot of fiction is, it's very internalized. There's a lot of people thinking, and as we know in the theatre, a character who thinks a lot and doesn't say much is quite tricky. So you've got to find ways around that, either devices which allow characters to express what's going on inside, which is comparable with a Shakespearean soliloquy, I suppose. You know, Hamlet, a lot of what he's doing is ruminating and speaking his thought. So you either have to find a kind of device like that, or you just have to find a credible way in people acting on their thoughts, because drama rests on action, and action is things that people do in pursuit of their desires and wants. Somebody described it as spiritual energy moving outwards. That's what dramatic action is. So when in Platonov's story he says, somebody he actually says in the story, if things had carried on the way they were with the central character, he would have stopped thinking, and stopped speaking, and before long he would have stopped thinking too. That's quite hard. That's quite a challenge to dramatise all that, but it's it's been a great thing, and I think the production that Menagerie have created is, I'm biased obviously, but I think it is a thing of beauty, and certainly people in Russia responded to it like that. I was a little afraid because taking their own story to them was a bit like selling coals to Newcastle. It felt slightly, they could respond, well, what's this ignorant English bloke doing, messing with our much loved story? But the response was that it was very Russian, which I think was a good thing. I'm clinging to the idea that was a good thing.
But it's also it allows you those layers. So you were saying that Platonov, is that who you say?
Yeah.
He was an independent voice. He was clear-sighted about the world in which he was inhabiting, and it sounds like you're able to bring that too. So there's a freshness or an outsider perspective that you can bring, even whilst it's also feeling authentic to
yeah. And obviously the trick was, in a way, for the Russians, because a lot of them know that story. In a way, that creates a kind of different dynamic, in a way, because they're then watching how this story is revealed and realized. Here, it's slightly different. We don't know this story at all. So moment by moment, it has got to sort of take us, take us with it. So that was interesting too, to find out whether it worked for a non-Russian audience as well. And so that's what the performance in Cambridge were about, really, sort of testing that. And again, it seemed to work. I mean, I think in a way it's got a lot going for it. It's a story about two young people, who you desperately want to succeed, but they have all sorts of problems to overcome. So there's a lot going for it, I think, as a story, and it is very resonant in many different, as you say. It's resonant in very many ways.
I can't wait to see it. I had a sense of, it was one of those lockdown moments where you see stuff in your diary that's just never gonna,
Yes.
like it's a ghost in your calendar, isn't it? And it was one of
that's
the
right.
moments in lockdown that I just had that. So hopefully it will happen soon.
Yeah, let's hope.
Thank you so much for talking to me, Fraser. I've really
That's
enjoyed it.
fantastic.
And thank you for joining us for this conversation. We hope you can join us again for the next one. We offer a Master's in Creative Writing and Writing for Performance here at ICE, which Fraser teaches on, as well as various postgraduate certificates and diplomas. And you can check the description box below for more information about these courses and about the books and the projects that we've mentioned in the course of this discussion. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you.